Good evening. Welcome to our live World Radio Day celebration here at PhillyCAM. I'm Alex Lewis, independent radio producer based here in Philly. And like most people here at this event, I've basically never been on TV before. And so you get to see an event where a bunch of people who usually work behind the scenes or behind microphones are now on live television. It's very exciting. In the spirit of the event, I wanted to read UNESCO's description of World Radio Day. A day to celebrate radio as a medium, to improve international cooperation between broadcasters and encourage major networks and community radio alike to promote access to information, freedom of expression, and gender equality. Although we can't celebrate all those things here, we've brought together a collection of Philadelphians who cover a broad range on the radio spectrum, from podcasters to sound artists, to public radio reporters, to DJs. So it's a celebration of the creative audio offerings that we have here in our city. And to start out with, we have Joyce Lieberman, who is WHYY's radio engineering supervisor. She's worked at the station for over 30 years. She helped launch Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and has continually helped evolve WHYY's technical systems and equipment. And she'll be in conversation with Elana Gordon, who's a reporter with The Pulse, WHYY's weekly show on science and health. And so here's an early billboard she put together for Fresh Air.
From WHYY in Philadelphia, I'm Terry Gross, and this is Fresh Air. Welcome to the premiere of the daily edition of Fresh Air. Each day on Fresh Air, you'll hear from people at the forefront of the arts, entertainment, and contemporary culture. We start our first show with a celebration of Irving Berlin's 99th birthday. Singer Peggy King will be here to perform some of her favorite Berlin songs for us. Also on today's show, exiled Chilean novelist Isabel Allende talks about her second book of Love and Shadows. Music critic Francis Davis says a new recording of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue lets us finally hear the piece the way Gershwin intended it. And TV critic David Bianculli says goodbye to Hill Street Blues. That's all coming up on Fresh Air.
Thank you for talking with me and with everybody to celebrate World Radio Day. That billboard, when was that?
That was May 11th, 1987.
And that was a very special billboard, right? What did that signify?
Well, it was the first show of, the first billboard of the first national show that was broadcast in Philadelphia. Before that, Fresh Air had been going on since 1975, and it was a 3-hour local show. And then the Fresh Air crew got a grant to be able to do it nationally, and we put together that show.
So one of the things I'm really struck by, radio today, it's like highly digital. Mm-hmm. And so when I hear that, what would you have been doing to make that billboard then that would have been different?
We were recording on reel-to-reel tape. It was all 1/4-inch analog tape. We still have an analog console, so everything goes through the console. You record onto the tape. The music was recorded, we recorded a whole session with Jackie Byard, a couple of months before so that we had the music. Terry would go into the studio and record her voice with the billboard, with the music. And for that day, we did have the singer live in the studio, so that was very exciting, Today, Fresh Air would do it differently. We'd pre-record an interview with a musician, but for the first couple of years, we would record the people live that day while the show was going out live to National Public Radio.
So you've done a lot in terms of seeing this public radio station through to new facilities, to updating the technology and everything else, but you've actually been with WHYY. You got your start 41 years ago?
Right.
I'm really curious, how you got started in radio and what that was about.
Well, I started out volunteering at the station, and that was even before 41 years ago. I guess I've been working there for 41 years. So about 3 years before I finished college, and I joined my husband in Philadelphia. And I was looking for lots of different things to do. And one thing that looked really interesting was that there was a radio collective producing a show called Learning to Fly. The radio collective was called Radio Free Women. And there's a kind of a dorky picture of me, but and some of my friends.
So it was a women's collective?
Yes, a women's collective. And there were about, over the 3 years I was with the group, there were about, 10 to 15 people that would contribute to different shows. We would do montage type shows. We'd go out and do women in the law, women in healthcare.
And you were on air?
I was on air.
So then how did you make the switch to engineering?
Right. The producers needed to sit with the engineers. They would cut up the tape. So it was reel-to-reel tape, and you do splicing with razor blades, and we'd have to sit and say what we wanted in and out. And I watched the engineers getting really good levels on us and adjusting the microphones.
Like the sound levels
right.
and everything.
And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. Maybe I could do this for a career. Maybe I could become a radio engineer. So I got that idea. And then I enrolled in a technical school. I went to Philadelphia Wireless Technical Institute, which doesn't exist now, but had existed for a really, really long time. There had been women that went through the school. At the time, I was the only woman, and I learned basic electronic theory. Mm-hmm. And it was exciting to be learning something like that, hoping that I would get a job someday.
And so then you got a grant to actually start working at WHYY. I wonder what that was like. You mentioned there weren't many women in the industry. Like, right. What was it like to kind of be in a place where it seemed like it would be predominantly male-dominated?
Right. Well, the station had applied for a grant. They got the Corporation for Public Broadcasting grant, and it was a minorities training grant to train a woman in broadcasting. I knew that there weren't a lot of women in TV doing, camera operators or audio, and at the radio station there were no other women engineers at the time. So I applied, about 30 people applied, maybe 3 were qualified, and I felt very honored and lucky to get the position. And then I came into this all-male group, and everyone was very welcoming. There was some chuckling, like, oh my goodness, she's going to work in the tape room. We're down here in the basement, or she'll have to go out to the transmitter. There was chuckling, but everyone was welcoming and showed me how to do things. They showed me how to, do wiring and solder and look at wiring diagrams and things like that.
What happened though when you wanted to play more of a role in some of the shows?
Oh, so I was trained for 18 months, and then they asked me to stay. So I had a full-time position, and I had been working a lot in TV. I did a lot of on-air switching for television, and then I settled in radio, and I was okay doing regular shifts. We would work regular shifts. I worked on Fresh Air a lot. And there were other shows. There was this one show, 91 Report, which was a half-hour daily show of Philadelphia news, very similar to what we have now, which is called Newsworks. It's a half-hour daily show. And I kept asking to do it, and my manager said, no, you're not ready to do it. You can't do that. So I'd go back and do the other shifts. And then finally, 3 guys who did the show, they were sick one day. So I had to do it, and I did fine. And then I was scheduled on the show the following week, and I had stomach aches. I was sick myself, but no, I lived through this.
Everything went a-okay.
Everything went fine.
Yeah.
Everything went fine.
Yeah.
Right.
And so then you went on to help launch Fresh Air when it went national. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to, there's another clip that you brought and shared, and I'm wondering if we could play that clip too, because what was different then is a lot of the stuff nationally, I was struck, was live, mm-hmm. happening between. So can you maybe set up what we're about to hear?
So it's a Robert Siegel. So Fresh Air was on before All Things Considered. Fresh Air is, we do our main show at a different time now. We send it out to National Public Radio at noon. But in the past, it was right before All Things Considered. Maybe All Things Considered was on at 4, maybe we were on at 3, I don't remember the exact timing. And we would do a live promo with, mostly with Robert Siegel or with another host. Right.
You can hear full coverage of today's news on All Things Considered. Robert Siegel, who co-hosts the program, is joining us from Washington. Hi, Robert.
Hello, Terry.
What's new for the show today?
Well, we're following the Iran-Contra hearings today, and we hope we'll have a report on the Soviet Central Committee, the party meeting in Moscow. And we'll also have more than our usual amount of music on the program today.
Like what, for instance?
Like Ravi Shankar, for instance, and also this.
John Paul, Holy Father, God called you by name. John Paul, Holy Father, humbly you came.
Leon Zarsky of Hamtramck, Michigan, that is, who's written a song for the Pope. He's a Grammy Award winner for his polkas, but this is a piece in honor of the Pope's coming to America later this year.
Okay. Well, I was going to guess it was him, Robert.
I can never fool you.
Yeah, hey, just kidding. Well, thanks, Robert. Those stories and more coming up on All Things Considered from National Public Radio.
We don't do that anymore.
Yeah, that was, right. We don't do that. We actually did pre-record it.
Yeah.
We pre-recorded it and then added it in.
So we just have a few minutes left, and before there was a photo of a reel-to-reel machine, and I know you brought some props because I was really curious about, like, behind the scenes, what some of, like, how technology and radio has changed. So I'm wondering, one of the things that would have happened for National, what was it called?
Tapes from National Public Radio or from other stations, other local stations across the country, were bicycled around the country. And it doesn't mean that someone was on a bicycle taking them, but they were mailed, but it was called bicycling a tape. Of course, a reel-to-reel tape, some of them look like this with plastic and tape. This one was from Sane Views the World, which was a show that we produced at WHYY. And tapes would get mailed all over the place. And Terry actually, when she did the local show, she would use lots of tapes that were mailed to her from National Public Radio that were bicycled around.
So as like, what else do you have? What's in your bag of props?
Well, I have, when we had cart decks and cart machines. And these have tape in them. There's a 1/4-inch tape that you record on. And they're designed so that the machine will put a cue at the beginning. So you start recording, there's a cue, you record, and then it rewinds to the beginning. So if you're doing a news show, for instance, and you have the mayor saying something or Elana saying something, and you have a host, and that person is tying everything together, you might have the host talking and then you hit the cart. Then you have the host talking and then you hit the cart so that you could hear the mayor or Elana. And the tapes always queue up again. We've transitioned to having a automation system and a large hard drive.
Is there anything that you like absolutely don't miss about some of this old stuff as we wrap up?
Right. I don't miss these. They were a pain in the neck. Sometimes they wouldn't queue up. For a show, you'd have like a stack this high, and you hope the stack doesn't fall down, and you're putting it in, taking it out, putting it in, taking it out. What's interesting about the new automation systems is they're set up similarly. They almost look like cart decks. They look like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cart decks, but it's so much easier to get the audio there.
Thank you for keeping the station on air.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You're watching our live World Radio celebration, a live World Radio Day celebration here at PhillyCAM. I'm sure for a while when we said World Radio Day, we were thinking about radio that's on the airwaves, but I think we have to take a little more expansive of a view of it and think about not only podcasting and the digital realm, but also sound design and sound art. And so our next guest is Shani Aviram, who is a composer and a sound artist. And she was also the artistic director of the Megapolis Audio Festival that took place here last year. So here's Shani. That was Shani Aviram. So coming up next, we have Chenjerai Kumanyika, who is a scholar, artist, and an activist who currently works as a professor at Rutgers University. He is also currently the co-executive producer and host of Gimlet Media's UnCivil. And he'll be talking with Mooj Zadie, who is an assistant producer with Fresh Air and the host of Tape, a radio show about radio.
And do we want to start off with a clip, or should we save that till later?
This happens with radio producers around TV. I want to start, so last year, Chenjerai featured on the podcast Seen on Radio, Seeing White, an audio documentary series exploring whiteness in America. And here's podcast host John Bewin in conversation with Chenjerai at the end of an episode.
There's a tendency to think that human beings looked around at some point in the distant past and said, well, let's see, there's some of us who look this way, and then those people over there look that other way, and those people over there look that other way. So I'll just describe us as, black, white, yellow, red. But this history on this continent shows something so different, which is that it was constructed with very specific purposes in mind, lines drawn around the definition. And it really alters how you see the meaning of black and white, doesn't it?
And I gotta say, there's kind of like good news and bad news on that note, It's like, the good news is, it really, when you think of this thing called whiteness, there's not anything genetic that, you really share with folks that's different from what we all share with each other. So there's a message in here about our connectedness. But the bad news is that, in a way, the effort to get people to come together under the banner of whiteness is sort of always been about power and exploitation. So I don't know what that means about trying to salvage the idea of like good whiteness. That's something that you got to wrestle with.
Right.
When was whiteness good? It's kind of like, when was America great?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like the whole project was related to exploitation. And so if you identify that way, I don't envy you in terms of having to try to think about what that means,
Chenjerai, thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me. We have 15 minutes to basically solve the problem of race in America.
And they started off with my meanest clip.
Do you want to defend yourself?
No.
Okay. So basically, I want to talk about your journey into radio, and I want to talk about the two shows that you're featured, one that you co-host, and one that you're featured in the series. But to start off, I just want to talk about NPR just released their staff diversity report for 2017. Came out last month. And I'm just going to read the numbers real quick. So in 2012, the percentage of black employees at NPR was 12%. In 2013, it was 10.9%. In 2014, it was 9.5%. And the year after that, it was 8.8%. And 2016, it was 8%, and then last year, it was 8.8%. So it's just kind of incredible. Nothing's really changing. And at the end of the article, in which they kind of, talk about this information, they're like, maybe something will change next year. It's as if wishing it will make it happen, like just having good intentions. But setting that aside for a second, so you don't work at NPR proper. I don't work at NPR proper, but we both work in radio. And I'm just kind of curious, how did you find radio and how did you come to be a part of this world?
Well, I think the journey really starts for me, when I was living in Philadelphia at around 95, and I used to be driving around, and I just became a fan of public radio. And so it's really exciting for me to be involved because I just, I remember kind of fiddling around with the dial and bumping into probably like big shows like This American Life and being like, you know, kind of caught my attention. Or I was a big fan of Fresh Air, you know, and you know, so I started as a fan listening, but one of the things I noticed was that the voices I was hearing, while they were really entertaining and interesting, they didn't sound like the kind of communities I was spending my time around. You know, earlier today, I don't know if you could tell, I was in the barbershop today, you know, and
Looking good.
sat in there, sat in there for about 2 hours, and we had different conversations. All kinds of things came up, and the things that came up, some of them, like for example, affordable housing, which we talked about, would also be talked about on the radio show, and also, on public radio, and also in the barbershop. But the way they talk about it on public radio, I can't imagine it being played ever in that barbershop. So when I took a transom workshop and started to raise these issues and what that meant for the way I could speak as a narrator.
And transom is like a radio learning workshop.
Right, transom. I took this workshop because I wanted to learn how to make radio, and it was it's an expensive workshop, and so that's an obstacle because it's a great training place. You know, I work with them; they're doing great things, but you have to have a lot of certain kind of life circumstances to even be able to access that, right? You have to, first of all, be able to take time off from work, and then you have to afford it. You got to be able to travel. But in doing that workshop, I went in a conversation with Rob Rosenthal about this, and I wrote a piece called Vocal Color in Public Radio for Transom initially, and it seemed like a lot of people in public media paid attention to it. And in a way, I was kind of invited in. People started to work with me and have conversations about that piece, but it was also a way for me to learn radio, actually at a high level to start out with, because immediately I was invited to like be on All Things Considered and Code Switch.
And during that workshop, you kind of faced your own dilemma versus, you know, there's this problem that you speak of where you go to a barbershop, it's the same topic, but it's not, the way that it's being spoken about is completely different. And then when it came for you to make your first radio story, or your first radio story at the program at Transom, you had your own conflict of like having to like code switch yourself. Like you bumped up against that a little bit.
That's right, yeah, because I was listening to Terry Gross and like Ira Glass and Robert Siegel, you know, and so then when I went to go read my piece, I found myself doing these weird moves. I was trying to sound like them.
How did you sound?
I don't know. I was doing the thing about fishermen, so I probably just was like, you know, I forget his name is John Towski. I think I was like, John Towski, you know, was a fisherman in Catalina. And then I was like, wait a minute, James, why are you sounding like you don't talk anything like this? You know, like why are you doing that?
And no one was pressuring you necessarily. Like it was you weren't like an editor who's like, you need to sound this way. It was more internal.
No, it was the internal editor. Later though, I did wind up talking to people like, you know, a lot of people came out in response to my piece because this thing about your voice, I think, and whether our voices are good enough is something people identify with. And I mean, a lot of women who it seems in radio and other places, women's voices are never good enough. There's all kinds of ways. It's just like, women, could you just please sound like men, you know? And they came out and told me about experiences where there was overt instructions, like don't sound like that, no uptalk, none of this, none of that, right? But it's that, right, in some context where you're being told good radio doesn't sound like this. And then also the internal thing where we're trying to orient ourselves towards the voices that we have availability to. And I feel like I don't want to do this thing where like people of color sound a certain way. Like there's no essential way that black people or, you know, or brown people talk. But there's that thing I'm telling you about the barbershop, right? Like what if my barber who's talking very knowledgeable about affordable housing came onto public radio, is that going to be acceptable? Or I lived in South Carolina, right? Now the people there in South Carolina who on top of that have a deep Southern accent, if they come and talk about the issues. And you know, I just want to say quickly, the response was interesting because, and this is one of the ways I think that whiteness and patriarchy hides, is that people were like, well, we just need something that will communicate to everybody. So it was like the way in which our ideas about what professionalism means encodes all these other structures.
Yeah. So then just like fast track a little bit. So you got invited on a high level to like come and talk about these ideas and how to solve them. And then how, you know, like, so yeah, just kind of take me briefly through that journey. Like, so then what happened next? How did you end up on Seeing White? And then how did UnCivil come about?
So I wound up, you know, I worked with people like Alicia Montgomery really invited me in, and Gene Demby and the folks on Code Switch really supported me. And in terms of telling that particular voice story on NPR. And then I did another workshop at the Duke Center for Documentary Studies, and that's where I met John Biewen. And we started having these conversations. And I think he kind of had the idea that he wanted to do this podcast on whiteness. And that was a little strange because, as a African-American intellectual, I have to be careful of these moments where you get invited into the racial conversation. I'm going to solve race relations over a beer, and I'm like, no, I think oftentimes what needs to happen is, I'm like, how about instead of that, you just like go read Nell Irvin Painters, somebody like that, or somebody who studied this, right?
Yeah.
And I will too, right? But John was had already read Nell Irvin Painter and was like, he wanted to really do this a different way, put the lens on whiteness. So we started to have these conversations, and then eventually we just started turning those conversations into that show. And that was really exciting. So that was how I got involved with Seeing White.
And then real quick, I've attended a race-related workshop once or twice in my life, so these ideas weren't necessarily 100% new, but it was really interesting revisiting them, and John did an amazing job kind of walking you through it.
Right.
And in addition to that said, I guess what I'm trying to say, in addition to that, I was extremely surprised by some of the statements that were made. I just want to quote you saying, this was early on, maybe the second episode, whatever social justice victories have been won, it isn't because of America, it's despite America. It's resisting America and the dominant laws of the land, whether it's the criminal justice system or the economic system. And I've just never thought about it in that way. Because a lot of the narrative is usually, I don't know, when Obama, for example, talks about progress, it just seems
well,
it doesn't sound like we're going against the grain, and that was that notion of we are going against the grain in order to progress.
Yeah, thank you for pointing to those. I think one of the things that radio does really well, and why I'm in love with radio, is that you can do those deep dives and really get to those structural issues. And I think that on the issue of race, one of the main interventions that John made, and hopefully I contributed to, was to talk about structural racism, to really break that down for people who don't get that and get past sort of race relations. So America does this really insidious thing where they oppress people, exploit people, and then they even kill people, and then later somehow incorporate that into a narrative about what's so great about America, right? 10 years from now, what's so great about America is going to be Me Too, And I think that actually there's a lot of American things, that are what institutionalized the problems that have led to Me Too, right? So I feel like women are pushing against America. Now, I'm aware that I have this very kind of critical narrative, but one of the things I've learned in the process of working on some of the other projects is that some people have a different narrative about America, where it's a place that does represent a certain promise. But I just think it's good to have a critical dialogue about that.
Yeah. Because basically you talk about all the structures that are put in place to this, again, this is a systemic issue. I think the one thought that I had recently, just to push back against that a little bit,
Sure.
is that, so I lived in the Middle East, and the one notion about America that always appealed to me, or the main notion I would say, is just the fact that if you're born in America, you're automatically you're an American citizen. So in that way, it just seems like you're not really being pushed against, but maybe you have ideas on that. Does that make sense? That's the one.
Like Barack Obama? Automatically an American citizen.
But I don't know. I don't know if that's something that you want to speak to, or that's one thing that came up that crossed my mind. Where in terms of how does that fit in? And that is the idea of America, where a lot of countries around the world don't grant you citizenship just because you were born on their soil.
Citizenship, what it really means in America, is something that's really interesting, right? I mean, for real, who really is a citizen in America, even right now? I mean, before 1965, when you had, the Voting Rights Act and all these other kinds of laws passed, I would argue even African Americans weren't really citizens. You couldn't really vote. Are Puerto Rican citizens right now? You look at what's going on. And then, are women citizens when you see the narratives of what it means to endure life in this country? So that's one thing. But at the same time, right, me coming with my critical perspective, listening to the experiences of immigrants and what it meant for them in that moment when they were pronounced American citizens, and the possibilities that it offered. I mean, that's real. That is a thing that makes me have to reevaluate and say, I don't want to crush that or sort of like not. I want to hear that narrative and understand what that means, and really let that help us make America something America has never actually been.
Yeah. And we're just kind of ping-ponging around, but so you were part of the series Seeing White, and then and now you have a show called UnCivil, and it's basically looking at the Civil War and the untold stories that occurred during the Civil War. So why pivot towards that direction? How did that come about, and why did you decide to look at the Civil War in particular, and what did you hope to get out of that project?
Right. Well, I just found that so many of these conversations we were having about monuments, which really at the point we started were not where they are now.
When you started the show.
We started the show,
Yeah.
and about the nature and character of this country.
How long was it before the
Probably a
discussion?
year and a half.
Yeah.
Jack Hitt called me up, and Alex Bloomberg at Gimlet, and we started bouncing around ideas. But it was kind of like not, it was. I was interested because I had myself. At that moment I was living in South Carolina at a university that was that essentially, Clemson University is on the former plantation of John C. Calhoun. So you sort of can't escape you're immediately in the Civil War when I'm walking past a plantation to go to work. Yeah. But when we first talked about it, it was kind of like, I was into it, but I was like, how are we going to convince people that the Civil War is relevant, And then, now we don't have that problem. I just think so many things about the battles, social justice issues that we're fighting now, whether you're talking about voting, whether you're talking about the gender roles, whether you're talking about even the transgender issues, which I'm giving you little hints about what's in our series if you haven't heard it. But all those things, I think, have a history. And so this was a really cool and interesting way to talk about that history and explore a different way of doing history, but also connect it to current struggles.
Gotcha. And then recently, like yesterday, Chelsea Clinton tweeted that she listens to the show and that she's a fan of the show.
Yeah.
And one thing you said in the green room is like you didn't know how to respond because not only are you a radio host, you are a professor and you're also an activist. And why was it difficult to respond to what she had to say?
Well, it was exciting, right? To think like, oh wow, Chelsea Clinton's listening. That means who people? I guess we're getting out there. There's a lot of podcasts, and I think that it's important for us to think critically about what role the Democratic Party has played and where we're at right now, and the limitations of some of the perspectives that people who I think are sincere about. I don't buy into this narrative of anybody being evil and wanting to just crush resistance, but when that kind of happens, then I think you have to actually think critically about that. So me publicly aligning myself in a real cozy way with Chelsea Clinton, I just had to think about it. You know what I mean? I thanked her. I tweeted back, thank you for listening. Let's talk about funding public media, public education.
Yeah.
Let's celebrate radio. I was with it.
Yeah.
Good. I'm not trying to demonize Chelsea, but I was also like, I don't know how far I want to run with that.
Yeah. And has that presented other problems, like being an activist and being a radio producer? I guess you're not like straight up a journalist. You're more of a storyteller. I guess just in terms of like NPR, for example, like when the Women's March happened, there was like a memo sent out where like you cannot attend this because of your job. So do you have any conflict of interest? Does that ever come up?
Yeah, I think I think that's a real dance. I think when I came into this as an activist, so what I first felt was I was encountering was public media had been this place where you could have really deep conversations. But then I also found that there was kind of a hostility toward activists in certain places that I was encountering. And I don't know if that was just journalists really trying to be objective and people just really being shackled to what I think is a really backward notion of objectivity. Like we have to just treat all crazy perspectives like they're the same. Right now in Philadelphia, and I think there are journalists who are covering this stuff, but I would say we're in a key moment right now when it comes to battles about the school district, when it comes to what's going on with the district attorney. This is a model and really interesting, fascinating things. There's things going on in the child welfare system that have to be explored, and I think Philadelphia can be a beacon and an interesting experiment for the rest of the country about what it means to resist horrible things coming down the pike. And the question is, where's public radio in that? Like this, I think there's an opportunity to be more all over it. Mm-hmm. So that's the battle I'm fighting. At the same time, on the other side, let me just say, working with like really talented journalists, I understand why you have to be a critical thinker. In this fake news era, you can't just, you have to really do your work. And one thing Gene Demby really taught me is when the next
Who's an NPR reporter.
Gene Demby working at Code Switch, which
Yeah.
is kind of like, I consider myself part of the family. I was on their first episode. One thing he's talked about is the need to really, sometimes you have to hold back and get all the facts. You can't be an activist, right? As soon as something happens, I'm out there tweeting, I'm out there in the street. A journalist, you have to make sure you get the story right. And that's a learning piece for me.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for sitting down to talk to me.
Thank you, man. Thank you. This was
I really
great.
appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was Chenjerai Kumanyika with Mooj Zadie. You're watching our live World Radio Day celebration here at PhillyCAM. And we're here at the last part, and we're going to feature someone who is on the station here at PhillyCAM, WPPM 106.5 FM. It's Lorne Peart, also known as Maggie Thump. He's executive producer of MAGZ FM, a music show on the station featuring an eclectic mix of new music and interviews with local artists. So Lorne?
4, 3, 2, 1.
MAGZ FM is an artistic endeavor masquerading as a music/pop culture radio show. It is a side hustle to the Maggie Thump Show, which is a music/pop culture radio show masquerading as a podcast, where the Maggie Thump Show seeks to engage the individual, MAGZ FM seeks to engage the collective. Taking full advantage of segues within the program, we are able to be creative, hopefully enhancing the listener experience.
I'm here. Can you see me?
We got to the club and he just asked me when was the last time he really felt something. I said, I don't know. And he hit me. So after he hit me, I was really a little confused because here's this really gentle, gracious cat. I mean, a perfect gentleman. And I'd heard stories about it, I just couldn't believe it. So I was looking around for a chair to hit him with. I went into the club, completely enraged. I couldn't even hear the music. And he was smiling, sitting with his ladies. And I screamed, if you ever touch me again, I'll kill you, at the top of my lungs. 3 or 4 times. He looks up at me and says, I'll always touch you.
That you just heard was from a previous broadcast. The song was a modern-day rendition of a Jimi Hendrix classic. Before the song ended, we extended it and we attached some audio from an interview with a member of the band. So that was fused into the audio to give it some journalistic appeal and to also give it some context and a deeper meaning of the song.
Where them gangsters at? Where them dimes at?
Incoming interview. Incoming interview. Incoming interview. Incoming interview.
Trey?
Yes.
How?
I can't hear you.
Oh, is this better?
Not much. Wait a second.
No? Better?
Very quiet.
Wow.
What's your name?
Maggie. Thump.
Okay, nice to meet you.
So you can't really hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Is it better?
Yeah, now it's much better.
Oh, fantastic. Awesome. Alright, give me a sec. I want to get these levels right. So you're not distorting. Alright. Is that better?
For me, it's fine. How is it for you?
It's fantastic.
Okay, good. And I can actually understand you. That's nice.
And now, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Invite your attention.
All right. So my artist's name is Elf, E-L-F, and I'm located in Zurich, Switzerland. And I'm a 3D painter, and I'm as well doing...
That second clip, we believe, nicely shows how we utilize segues within the transition to prepare the listener and to get them in the headspace so they can fully appreciate and what is about to continue.
You eat potatoes every day because you like them. You mash them, bake them, cook them, fry them. You eat them alone, with friends or with your family. You did nothing wrong. You just enjoy eating your potatoes. Your neighbor likes potatoes too. He sits on the window with his boiled potato. He eats half and throws the other half on the passerby. The passerby gets hurt. Another passerby sees this and he comes to you, not your neighbor, and tells you what a threat you are. Because you eat potatoes. You did nothing wrong. You just ate potatoes. Because you like potatoes. The passerby keeps blaming you, says bad things about you whenever they get a chance. This makes you angry. If you get angry and speak up for yourself, all the passers-by jump in excitement and say in unison, "We knew it. A person who likes potatoes is violent and can harm us."
The third clip is what we use in the segue to express personal views, storytelling, sharing information. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. MAGZ FM is Saturdays here on WPPM. I encourage you to get a moment, check it out. And thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for coming to our live World Radio Day celebration here at PhillyCAM. I want to thank all our guests, Joyce Lieberman, Elana Gordon, Chenjerai Kumanyika, Mooj Zadie, Lorne Peart, and Shani Aviram. One thing I want to say before I go, again, I'm Alex Lewis, independent radio producer here in the city. The reason I was asked to do this was because I'm interested in putting together more events in the city that celebrate the creative audio community here in Philadelphia. So if you're here in the audience or you're here watching on TV, find me and we can talk about it. But to play us out, here's Shani again. Thank you so much.